Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our hosts, Razvan, especially for the invitation and your patience in all of my odd scheduling requirements. And then at the end of the day, I was stuck in San Francisco last night at an airport hotel. Nonetheless, I'm happy to be here. The presentations so far have been very interesting, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations this afternoon. I'm going to draw my presentation today from a book that I just finished, and I'm not on to another project yet, so for better or worse, my mind is still stuck here. This is the title of the book, How We Became Our Data. And I want to use this book to think about, I want to use this presentation to think about aspects of the book in which I'm taking up genealogically the history of the conditions of possibility of contemporary algorithmic culture. And I want to do that specifically with an eye to drawing attention to the data structures, or what I call the formats, that are crucial for any kind of algorithmic operation whatsoever. And the argument of the book, in short, is that there's a politics endogenous to information itself, a politics of data, and I locate this politics of data in, amongst other places, the formats of data. So the driving question for the book is this: what are the conditions that make it possible for us to be our data? The assumption in that question, of course, is that we are data, we are our data are ourselves. And if that's right, or perhaps you're skeptical of that, but to the extent that that's right, I want to ask what makes that possible. A caveat at the outset: of course, my claim is not the non-starter that we are our data and nothing else, or that we are nothing but data. Again, that's a non-starter. My claim is that we are our data also. We are data too. We have bodies, we have minds. I'm happy to concede souls for those who want them. Other concessions I will also make. My only insistence is that whatever else we are also our data. So I want to know, what are the conditions that make that possible? I'll start with some methodological bearings. I don't want to spend too much time on the methodological background, other than to say it took me the better part of a few years, not so long ago, to write a book on Foucault's genealogical method, which I've now condensed down into one slide. I won't even give you all of that slide. But I'm happy to talk more about Foucault. I love Foucault endlessly. At the same time, I take some things from Foucault and need to leave other things behind. I take from Foucault a methodological orientation, his conception of genealogy, which I would boil down to, in a phrase, a style of philosophical historical inquiry that places emphasis on complexity, contingency, and critique. Critique in the Kantian sense of an inquiry into conditions of possibility, but whereas Kant was interested in transcendental critique, connoting that which necessarily must be the case, Foucault, and I following Foucault, are interested in contingent critique. So the critique of contingencies, the contingent conditions of possibility that are nonetheless conditions of possibility. And with that comes an emphasis on complexity rather than, say, simplicity, or multiplicity rather than univocal explanations. So those are my 3 C's: contingency, complexity, critique. It may or may not help to also offer that the way I read Foucault, or the way that I'm taking up Foucault, is through philosophers like Ian Hacking and anthropologists like Paul Rabineau. That said, that may not be helpful if you don't know those names, but if you do, perhaps that is helpful. Complex and contingent conditions that shape us. What I need to leave behind from Foucault are his concepts of power. So my argument is that there, as I said at the outset, there's a politics endogenous to information itself, what I call an infopolitics or an info power. It is my claim that despite a growing swath of scholarship, that we cannot understand the political dynamics of contemporary data configurations and data assemblages through the lens of Foucault's concept of biopolitics, Foucault's concept of anatomopolitics, Deleuze's concept of control power. I again would not claim that we have, as it were, left biopolitics behind. I think that's a non-starter. But my claim is that the Foucault's notion of biopolitics does not exhaustively capture what we would need to understand the political dynamics of data today. So with that, let me turn to our present, which was not Foucault's present, and talk about where we find ourselves today. And let me just remind you of what you already know, what you already carry around with you in your phone or in your wallet, all of the credentialing that accompanies your life. Facebook login, email address and password, your bank accounts, frequent flyer accounts, credit card data, PayPal data, Bitcoin wallets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The endless streams of data through which you and I effortlessly, without even needing to think about it or doing hardly any work at all, transact our daily affairs. And my claim in the background is that who we are is in part a function of, again, not entirely, but in part a function of this data, that who we are is a function of what we do. What we do depends on the data technologies through which we act, and so it follows that we are our data, that ourselves have become in part data. And not trivially so, but significantly so. And you can just think about the following nightmare scenario, not just losing your wallet and all the identification and credentialing therein, which may have happened to some of us in this room at some point, but imagine everything else in the world staying the same, except you permanently lose all access to all of your personal data. Everything else stays the same. Everybody else has access to their permanent data, but you become, as it were, dataless. That would be a significant burden. That would be, I believe, a life-threatening burden for anybody. And in part, that points to some of the inequalities of which we are keenly aware in the context of the politics of documentation in this country. But the nightmare scenario would take that one step further: permanent loss of data, permanent loss of personal data. So the thought is that who we are, who we can be, is in significant ways dependent upon our data and our personal data. So my question then, genealogically, is this: how, and implied therein, when did we become kinds of persons who can be conditioned by our data? So I want to interrogate this question. I want to ask this question, again, in a genealogical mode. So let me just tour through a few familiar answers before I get to my own. Some people would say that our present data selves got their serious start back with Web 2.0, the 1999 to 2008 decade, the advent of .coms and then social media, and the massive financialization of what are today the world's largest companies like Amazon. This is the kind of answer that I think in many ways is intuitive, that there's something new and importantly new and excitingly new and newly new about all this data, all these algorithms, all this social media. This is the answer that unfortunately we are invited to think through by the purveyors of these data technologies itself. This is the answer of Apple, that you must have the newest new thing, you must have the newest new gadget, and whereas Apple has financial incentive to dehistoricize themselves, I don't think that we as scholars have any intellectual incentive to dehistoricize Apple, Facebook, etc. And I think that this answer, that this stuff is newly new, and that everything that's important about it is what's new about it, is dehistoricizing in a problematic way. Fortunately, there's a critical mass of scholarship in media theory and data studies that does historicize the informational culture in which we find ourselves. And the consensus answer in this historiography, at least as I read it, goes back to the year 1948, which is the year in which the man on your left, Claude Elwood Shannon, published his paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, and the man on your right, Norbert Wiener, published his book, Cybernetics. These were two different but theoretically related projects. Shannon, a communications engineer at Bell Labs, Wiener, an MIT mathematician, and together they consolidated their program into what has ever since been called information theory, which is one of the great misnomers of the critical historiography of data. Neither Shannon nor Wiener theorized information. Rather, they assumed a concept of information for the purposes of theorizing communication. That's a small historical footnote about which I'm happy to say more in Q&A if people are interested. Again, this is the answer that we get in the consensus historiography, that our informational culture today goes back to 1948, and perhaps the wartime exigencies that led to the creation of these post-war information technologies. This is the John Durham Peters answer, Catherine Hales, Friedrich Hitler. And this answer is in many ways right, but at the same time it suffers from a problem because it neglects to ask, why the uptake? Why was information theory so widely embraced? 7 years after this 1948 monumental date, James Baldwin referred to the cybernetics craze. Why was there a cybernetics craze? It wasn't just because these two men were uniquely smart. Perhaps they were uniquely smart, but as we all know, that's not enough to get taken up by an entire culture. So what were the conditions of acceptability for information theory? What did people have to believe about themselves and one another and their social configurations such that information theory would be an answer to a problematization that people were already living within? So my project takes me back to a moment in the early 20th century, the time in which Shannon and Wiener and their generation were in their phase at the age of maturation, when they were in college, when they were studying, when they were coming to be the kinds of people who they later would be. And in this period, I locate what I would call first generation data subjects. The 19-teens to the 1930s is the time in, and now restricting my argument to the US context, the time when Americans by and large became subjects of data, or what I call informational persons. And I focus on this period because these years exhibit the turbulent moment of emergence of the relentless datafication that we are caught up in today. I find this moment of emergence important. I would distinguish, in a technical sense, the historiographical category of emergence from that of origins. I'm not looking for the first moment of datafication of self. There are precedents, of course. We saw a slide of Benjamin Franklin earlier, Seneca. There are precedents in antiquity. But this is the era in which this kind of datafying of the self technology became practically obligatory. This is the era in which not just the eccentrics like Ben Franklin, but everybody started becoming datafied. And I take that to be significant. This is also the moment prior to that mid-century 1948 moment when things were very turbulent, when things were still very much unsettled. And I take that to be a critically interesting, or a critically essential, I should say, historiographical site, because it allows us to attend to the production and formation and design stages of technology before they become concretized, stabilized, and the furniture of everyday life. So this is a moment that would end with the kind of extensive credentialing. Remember all the Facebook logins and bank passwords that I mentioned a few minutes ago? The teens and the 30s are a moment that would end in people, again, effortlessly recognizing themselves through that. 1942 is kind of punctuating year for the story that I want to tell. Here's a quote: "Every law-abiding citizen today has his vast pockets crammed with credentials, a draft registration card, etc., etc. Practically, all of these stress the fact that I am me and nobody else. Without them, I would officially cease to exist." So this is the moment at which we have the emergence of the first glimmerings of a kind of clear apprehension of the extent to which who we are is dependent on our data. And this is a moment in which this kind of marking of the self becomes possible. In some ways, this is a striking image. This is a man from Oregon. This is a Dorothy Lang photograph. He has there tattooed on his right bicep his Social Security number, which is in some ways striking, but also in some ways for us, some 80 years later, almost banal. I'm not sure that many Americans have their Social Security numbers tattooed on them today, but I would be surprised if none did, and I wouldn't be all that surprised to meet somebody who had some such identifying label tattooed on their body. In fact, we're used to all kinds of tattoos on bodies that are means of self-identification. But whether this would be banal or not today, the more important point is that here we have in the late 1930s the emergence of somebody who wants to willfully express their identification with their personal data. So let me then try to tell this story about this 19-teens to 1930s period in a little more detail. I said that I wanted to present a genealogy. I'll use a metaphor of a tree. Of course, when you use the word genealogy on the airplane, when you fly down to San Diego, which I've learned not to do a long time ago, people will think you mean family trees, and that might lead to a misleading airplane conversation. All the conversations on the airplane for we academics are misleading anyway. But it turns out that the family tree sense is not all that inaccurate, with certain caveats, as a sort of useful leading metaphor for what we think of when we think of genealogy. And it's especially not a bad metaphor if we take our trees to be rhizomatic, as are, for instance, the quaking aspens that populate the mountain forests of the West. Some of you may have found yourselves in a quaking aspen forest somewhere in northern New Mexico or Colorado or somewhere else, or if not, just imagine you're in a quaking aspen forest, a forest of trees, white-barked trees, and you're used to thinking of a forest of trees as a collection of separate organisms, but quaking aspen are rhizomatic, which means they share the same root structure underground, which means that the forest you are standing in is all one organism. All the trees around you are one organism. So what you're accustomed to when you're standing in a regular forest, what you're accustomed to thinking of as trees are in a quaking aspen forest more like branches popping up out of the ground. And in a rhizomatic structure, rhizomes are interesting theoretically because it's what goes on down below in the rhizome that's of interest. And that's going to drive the way that I'm thinking about genealogy here today. So in the book project, I develop an account of infopolitics and infopower through an examination of a series of historical moments. I have a chapter focused on psychometrics and personality tests from 1917 to 1937. I have a chapter on the datafication of race and the prehistory of redlining, which is a practice of racial discrimination in government-backed mortgage markets that begins in 1934. In the book, I look at the prehistory of redlining and the technological understory of redlining as it developed in private real estate industry in 1923 to 1934 before the HOLC and FHA picked it up as government agencies and used it to turn the greatest opportunity for wealth accumulation in American history into also one of the most racially stratified moments of wealth accumulation in American history. I don't talk about genetic code in the book, but I wanted to, but I have a separate follow-up paper in which I talk about it. And in the book, I also talk about documentary identity, which is what I want to focus on here today. But partly I want to point out all these different trees just so that I don't mislead people into thinking that this is just a story about birth certificates and social security numbers and driver's licenses, et cetera. I'm interested in how data as a politics, how data as an epistemological a priori, and how data as a form of subjectivity invests us across a wide variety of domains from the 19-teens to the 1930s. So I'm going to focus on documentary identity, and specifically, I'm interested in the birth certificate. And I'm interested in those because odds are very good that each of you here have one, or if you do not have one, then you know how seriously burdening it is to not have one. Birth certificates are a prime example of how data has become practically obligatory for us to live our lives in the ways in which we think about living them in advanced liberal democracies. So if birth certificates are so practically obligatory, that allows me to reframe that question with which I opened. The question now becomes not just how do we become informational persons, but more precisely, how do we become persons for whom such a scrap of paper as this could matter so much to what we can do, to who we can be, to who we cannot be, to what we cannot do. And birth certificates are not just interesting in that they're breeder documents, that's the official term for them in the literature, by which is meant that out of birth certificates are bred all the other forms of documentary identity that you have. That's why that's the one that you do not want to lose. They're interesting because of that, because they play that role for us, but they're also historically interesting, and they exemplify what I was calling earlier this cusp of consolidation moment, or this moment of a turbulent emergence. Because birth certificates took 30 years to standardize. There was an effort from 1903 to 1933 on the part of the Census Bureau, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, the American Child Health Association, a whole host of associations. It took them 30 years to achieve what they considered to be a satisfactory standard of birth registration, 90% of persons in all states. In 1933, 90% of all newly born babies in all states were being registered. And that contrasted to 1903, when that number was, the 90% number was not even estimable. There was no state in which there were good record-keeping practices such that a state could perform an audit on how many babies are being registered. So it took 30 years to achieve 90% registration of newly born babies. Almost immediately afterward, it took 6 months for the Social Security Board and the United States Postal Service to enumerate 90% of American workers. So 30 years to achieve 90%, and then a few years later, 6 months to achieve 90%. So birth certificates are this interesting moment in which they're figuring out how to mass register, how to mass standardize, how to mass identify, like that. And afterwards, we get a quotidian repetition of that with Social Security numbers. And here's the SS5. This is the form that 90% plus of eligible laborers in the United States voluntarily filled out between November 1935 and spring of 1936. So how does all this work, and how is it significant? So in terms of my family tree metaphor, I like this metaphor in part because, again, it sort of offers us a way of thinking about sort of classic philosophical distinctions between surfaces and depths without appealing to outworn philosophical distinctions between appearance and reality. But we have surface knowledges in documentary identity. We have a host of sciences that are invested in the birth certificate project: epidemiology, demographics, population measurement, paralegal and record-keeping practices for the purposes of, for example, establishing title. A whole host of knowledge practices. How are we going to conduct public health practices such that we know that we're lowering infant mortality? Well, even measuring infant mortality presumes that you have a reliable record-keeping practice of how many infants are born and how many infants have died. So you need something like birth registration. So a lot of the projects, many projects that we take for granted today, and many projects that were very much at the heart of 19th century and ongoing biopolitics, are at play, are enrolled in this production of the birth certificate. Then you have surface politics, human welfare projects. Herbert Hoover in Europe after World War I working to lower infant mortality rate. You have official policies like child labor laws, child labor regulations. Obviously, again, that would depend on having proof of how old one is. And then you have census efforts, Census Bureau efforts at social measure. This is all the stuff that, again, this is I'm just drawing your attention here to what would be obvious to anybody who went to look at any historical or archival sources. This is everything that's on the surface. This is everything that's just clear. And you get a number of kinds of persons or forms of subjectivity that begin to be produced through the birth certificate. You get, most obviously, registered babies. But you also get now legal title holders, eligible child laborers, eligible beneficiaries, et cetera, et cetera. So this is everything, again, that you would be aware of just by going and looking at the archive. This is everything that people at the time would have been tuned into, would have been aware of. And I'm interested, though, in part, in addition to that, I'm interested in this Foucauldian move of explaining the conditions of possibility. What are the historical conditions of possibility? What are the depth conditions? What are the pouvoir and the savoir that fund everything up above that we know? And we have down below what I call a data episteme, an assumption that knowledge is data, an increasingly widespread assumption that knowledge is data. And again, this is happening in the 19-teens to the 1930s. This is not just some new invention of Apple, Google, et cetera. Then you have here the emergence of what I call infopower. Again, a distinctive modality of power that's irreducible to biopolitics, irreducible to disciplinary politics, and then of course also irreducible to classical models of sovereign legal state politics. And what I hope to draw attention to with this concept of infopower in part is the politics of formatting. The ways in which formats exercise power over who we can be. And in part, I want this concept to help draw attention to the way that the formats that we have designed have greater impact on who we are and on what we can do than we would commonly think. And these formats have a power on us insofar as they become terrain for inequality. They become a terrain for unfreedoms. They become a terrain upon which social ills can be exercised. Again, just think of the burden of being paperless today in 2019 and the century of manufacture of paper-centric persons upon which that burden depends. And even in the context of critical data studies, where Legion scholars are now following Silicon Valley's data scientists in devoting attention to algorithms and the politics of algorithms, and this to me is very welcome, we still don't have that much attention at the scholarly level to data structures, or what I would again call formats. How do formats fasten us? And I use this term fastening in a double sense. Formats both pin us down and they speed us up. The formats in your Facebook profile pin you down. You have these attributes. These facts about you are needed to create your profile, and they also speed you up. They quicken your interaction with others, as you can measure at the end of my talk when you pull your phone out and see how many Facebook notifications you have received, and compare that to a version of yourself 10 years ago, or if you're too young, just imagine, when you would have attended this talk, and maybe you would have pulled a phone out at the end, or maybe you're pulling it out in the middle, but you would not have those Facebook notifications quickening that interaction, but also quickening it according to the terms, the standards of the formats through which you have even made yourself existent on Facebook. So if those formats matter for who we are and who we can be, they matter insofar as they help craft the shape of the informational persons that we have become. And that, in short, is my argument at the conceptual level. But what I really want to investigate, because for me, genealogy matters in enabling a form of attention to how all of this works. So this is the kind of conceptual shape of how I would argue info power fastens informational persons by way of formatting them according to the logics of a data episteme. And that argument, that conceptualization, I hope, is dependent upon the historical research that I've done regarding the trees of birth certificates, datafication of race, personality psychology, et cetera. But what do the actual details of that look like? How are these practices actually functioning? In other words, what's the trunk of the tree? What connects everything up above the surface, everything that's there, visible in the daylight, to the roots down below that we have to dig into to do the work of critique? So to look at this, I want to focus on information technology, data technology as a series of practices, which for very quick purposes I take to be conjunctions of concepts, affects, and technologies, and also for very quick purposes I want to just talk about in terms solely of technologies for today. So what are the technologies of the birth certificate circa 1903 to 1933? That's my question. And there are three technologies that are crucial for the emergence of a stable system of what has since become universal birth registration that continues to bind all of us. Someday it will disappear, but that day is certainly beyond our horizon. First, there are standard forms, then there are filing protocols, and then there are data audits. And I will try to go through these fairly quickly, much too quickly, but we can talk later if people are interested. So, standard forms, this is standard certificate of birth. And again, what I want to draw attention to here are the formats. The way in which persons are made legible, here at first to the state, but then following the state, a panoply of other organizations. They're made legible according to the formats on that form, the formats on that printed blank. those specific formats and not others. There are, for instance, other facts about born babies that could be on this form, or there are facts about born babies on this form that need not be there. And it's not my claim that that any of that is, as it were, sinister. This is not a conspiracy theory. The claim is just that the ways in which we design informational persons have downstream political ramifications in terms of the terrains of inequalities and unfreedoms those open up. So there are these standard forms, and that standardization is crucial to the stabilization of the birth certificate technology. Then there are filing protocols. This is an image of a pre-standardization record-keeping system whereby county registrars would copy birth data down into a book. The census and the other agencies that put in place the birth certificate system that we still have today, though ours is obviously migrated from paper records to computer records, is one that got rid of the book system. The book, they said, was needless. Why would you need a book? Why would you need to copy the data on a form into a book? If you want to copy the data on a form, you just copy it onto a copy of the form. What we do today, you make a copy. You make a copy of the file. So you go from that to this. You no longer have a book, but you have a filing protocol that looks very familiar to all of us. And if you have never found yourself in a room like this, you are already well aware of a room like this because this image is a metaphor for the file structure of your computer. And then you have data audits. And there's a long story to tell here, and given time, I won't tell it at any length other than to say that there was an enormous problem at the time of figuring out how to know if actually 90% plus babies were being registered, because what they were trying to develop at the time was an actual measure or count of born babies, and they didn't already have a measure or count of born babies at the time against which to compare the count of newborn babies that they have. So there's this conundrum anytime that you want to develop a measure or a count that you have to develop the first iteration of that. And what they decided to do for this was develop a data auditing technology. And the short version of the story is this is Julia Lathrop, who was the first female head of any US federal agency. She was the head of the Children's Bureau, which was founded in 1912. And between 1912 and 1915, Lathrop and her all-volunteer force of, or her all-women all-volunteer force of workers achieved in 3 years a successful audit of accuracy of birth registration practices, whereas the Census Bureau, just 4 years previous to the founding of her agency, had said that it was not possible. And as soon as she developed that, the census appropriated her birth registration test process and also failed to give her and her agency any credit for it. So there's a very interesting gendered politics to how these technologies stabilized. Again, there's a longer story there. I'm happy to talk more about it. And this is what you have at the end of these three technologies coalescing, but this last image depends entirely on that data audit. Again, you do not have good data if you do not know how accurate it is. And this shows states which have 90% plus registration. And actually, this image is from 1915, so this is not the end of the process. But this is the sort of the first year in which they had a good measure, thanks to the work of the Children's Bureau. So, very briefly then, these are the technologies of the birth certificate through which it standardized 1903 to 1933. And then the thinking of my project is that this is a history of the present, so that we could take these kinds of concepts and see how they apply as conditions of possibility for our present. So just to do a quick version of this with respect to social media and mass surveillance, which are the data technologies du jour, let's just see how those technologies port to our contemporary practices. And I'm going to do this in a kind of crude, very visualistic sense, so bear with me. But the thought is that we can analogize legacy media to new media. And we can see standard formats, storage protocols, and data audits still very much at the heart of how, again, this is emphasis on how contemporary data technologies work to shape subjectivities. So these three kinds of technologies shape not only early 20th century identity documents, but they also shape early 21st century social media. We have our standard formats. And again, we effortlessly engage them. You hardly need any training at all to be the teenager or tween or 6 or 7-year-old who can fill out a social media profile. We have our storage protocols, which are ever increasingly successful. And we have our data audit technologies, assessing the quality of these practices. And these are all bundled together into this assemblage of a stable and efficient and effective, which are not for me honorific terms, for better or worse, stable, efficient, and effective set of technologies. So that last part is quick, I realize. I'm happy to talk more about that as we go on. Let me just kind of try to sum up here by, again, summing up what I've done. Follow genealogical method. We start at the history of our present. We take that backwards to the moment of emergence, which for me is the 19-teens to the 1930s. And that's then productive, I would hope, of a concept of power that helps us understand how social media and mass surveillance and other data technologies, how algorithms shape subjectivity today. And I'll just sum this up in a crude table, which in some ways is meant to mirror the databases which this table is meant to be about. But my claim in short is that info power deploys techniques of formatting, techniques of formats in order to fasten or pin down and speed up its informational persons. That, in a sentence, is the argument of the book. And I contrast that to Foucauldian biopower, which again is still with us, but it does not exhaustively account for the politics of Facebook, the politics of Google, the politics of the NSA. I would contrast it to Foucauldian disciplinary power. I would contrast it to Deleuzian control power and other contemporary theories of the politics of data, references there to Bernard Harcourt, Tungwei Hu, and Natasha Scholl. So that, in short, is the story I want to tell. I tell it at greater length in this book, which my publisher tells me will be out in May. In the meantime, I'm happy to talk more today after Razvan's presentation, or if you prefer to email me at some point, I'm happy to talk via email, etc. So thank you all. I know your Facebook notifications are waiting for you, so appreciate it. So we have about 5 minutes. Oh, that's right. Okay. Andrew.
I have a question as a sort of a side issue, but it interests me. Redlining. I understand that redlining intended to create racially segregated neighborhoods, but I wonder if there were other sort of alibis for that, like questions about risk, crime, things like that, which were used in order to justify. That's a good
You're exactly right with the latter part, and in fact, it was not intended by anybody to create racial disparities. At least it was not intended by anybody at the Federal Housing Authority and Homeowners Loan Corporation, the government agencies that enacted this. So what my chapter on redlining is about the ways in which race was built into residential real estate appraisal algorithms in the 1920s. And then the very same people who built those algorithms and wrote textbooks about them. This was the era in which real estate as a practice was professionalizing. This is the era in which the term realtor was invented, which of course is still a registered trademark, and do not call your real estate broker a realtor unless they are a realtor, because they pay money to be a realtor. But and I mention all this because there's a whole sort of story of professionalization and scientization in terms of real estate accounting and accounting practices. And as real estate accounting was professionalizing and trying to make itself, and I would say succeeding in making itself legitimate as a science, again, for better or worse, the appraisal algorithms were being developed in ways that factored racial composition of neighborhoods into the assessment of the value of a home in a way that would be illegal today, 90 years later. And again, I have no view if it was the intention on the part of those real estate accountants or et cetera to institute a set of discriminatory home appraisal practices. In other words, I'm not as interested in the question of the attitudinal racism on the part of real estate professionals. I'm more interested in the structural racisms at the technological level that they left behind. So they built into these algorithms race but since you have a further question there, so.
Do you have a paper? Have you published an article on redlining that I could easily access?
In a better world, I would have worked up that chapter or in a different world, at least I would have worked up that chapter into an article before the book came out, but I didn't.
I'll have to wait.
Yeah, but the book will be out in 2 months, and Davide's read it, so he could, yeah. But I'm happy to send I'd be happy to send that along once I have a copy of it that's ready.
Great.
Just about the historical aspect of that,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to clarify a little bit. So I understand the move you're making where you're saying this is not necessarily the ex nihilo origin of all of these practices, but it is a distinctive period in which some of the stylings of what we recognize as datafication today might have come into a clear shape. So I wanted to ask you about that distinctiveness. So with something like cybernetics, regardless of all the different problems and regardless of how Shannon didn't intend for his theory to become what it became, there's a very distinctive understanding of information and of data and of the machine that, becomes a kind of a brand later on. And when you're mentioning things like standardized certificates, filing protocols, I'm also thinking of a lot of the 19th century forerunners, right? So we've got relational databases, essentially, when you've got all these humans around the US and Europe being asked to chart weather tables. You've got people like Alphonse Bertillon and Duchesne de Bouillon who are trying to create these anthropometric cars, and you know all about this. Yeah. So I guess the question for me there is, what is the skill or the style or the imagination in this first generation period that you would say is really distinctive from these other areas? And what's the distinctive contribution that this period or these technologies give to what we understand to be datafication? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, that's a fantastic question, which...
It's also too big.
No, it's the kind of question that unfortunately came into view for me after I finished the book, but which means I have I hope what is a decent answer to it now. So by way of a quick contrast, and then I can say more if need be, but yes, there are these 19th century technologies like anthropometrics or fingerprinting, but at that point, data, especially data as used to format, in my sense, persons, data as used to define, structure, canalize, and accelerate persons, was very much a wilderness. And birth certificates are a perfect example of this. And the metaphor of wilderness is intuitive to us today, and in fact was a metaphor that was intuitively used in the early 20th century by proto-data technologists or proto-data scientists, people who were doing data science but would not have recognized themselves as having done it. And they found themselves in this moment of information overload where the information was unmanageable. and there was this wilderness. And it was not, and the thing about that that's important for me is that it was not applied universally. The idea of it applying universally, of course, had been formulated. Bentham had proposed not only the panopticon, but universal identification tattoos. Leibniz and Fichte had proposed universal systems of registration. These were dreams in the 17th, especially 18th and 19th centuries, but they were fantasies at that time. They became realities in the early 20th century, such that you and I today, 100 years later, would find it unthinkable to not register our baby. And again, I'm not saying there's anything sinister or anything wrong with registering babies. My children, of course they have a birth certificate. Of course they do. But it's that of courseness, it's that naturalness of it that I want to put a spotlight on, because once you get to Wiener and go forward, things get consolidated, and they get consolidated to such a degree of density that we no longer have the habit of asking how these formats and technologies were designed. And I'm really interested in that design moment. So this 19-teens to 1930s period is this moment of turbulence, or again, I like this phrase, cusp of consolidation. It's before they consolidate. It's before they, as it were, deep freeze. And we see these technologies in formation, which to me throws a light on ways in which today people up in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, who knows where, are designing next generation technologies that will have lasting effects for a generation or generations to come. And we ought to hope that we can learn from the lessons of predecessor information technologies and be more attentive to how the formats build in certain kinds of proxies, build in certain kinds of assumptions, and just build into the structures of our lives a set of expectations that form a terrain for the generation of inequalities and unfreedoms and unfairnesses, et cetera. So it's that contrast between the wilderness in the 19th century, the consolidation with Wiener going forward. I'm interested in how we get from that wilderness to that consolidation, how we actually design stable, functional, working technologies.
We have time for one more question before
the next. Thanks for the talk. So similar to the last question, but pushing a little more. If this stuff was not new, as you said, with social media, what concretely with formatting like on the initial census forms was new in terms of categorizing people that, as you said, shuts down freedoms later on?
It's the new thing then was the very act of doing that. In other words, the new thing then was the very formatting or categorizing of persons on the birth certificate. I would not attribute the same thing to census forms. That's kind of a small nitpicky point, but it's the kind of thing I need to say because I take genealogy seriously as a practice of history, and census forms are very different than birth registration forms because the latter are identifying documents, whereas census forms are meant to be anonymized eventually and are meant to be used only at the populational or biopolitical level rather than as a way of drawing up and fastening individual persons. But it's that very act of universal registration. It's that very act of making it practically obligatory to be formatted in this way. And those acts, that work of formatting is what creates this terrain of inequalities. And it's only the most obvious example to state that that is the condition of possibility of it being a burden to be an undocumented migrant in the United States today. It can only be a burden to be undocumented if you find yourself in a social milieu or society or culture in which it's expected that everybody must be documented, and documented in this way. And again, that's not to say that it's sinister. I don't think the designers of the birth certificate had, as it were, evil intentions. It's rather it's the it's the politics of unthinkingness of it, right? And that's what concerns me. The efficiency of the success at stabilizing these technologies, the success at solving the scientific, engineering, technological challenges of the day without a set of cultural, social incentives that would push those geniuses who were successfully doing that scientific work to reflect on what it is they're building and what are the lasting consequences. And we find ourselves in the very same scientific culture 100 years later, where we have whiz-bang data scientists like Christopher Wiley, who was the whistleblower for Cambridge Analytica. You know, we have people like Mark Zuckerberg, who has designed one of the most astoundingly successful socio-technologies in recent history. Routinely, this technology violates persons' privacies and value expectations. Routinely, Zuckerberg stands up and offers his boy-faced apologies. They're very sincere. He is very sorry. And he's rewarded with a net worth of around, I think, $50 billion. That's the kind of social conception of technology and values that we find ourselves in the midst of. And that's not new. What Zuckerberg has done has been what we've been doing for at least 100 years with data technology, probably longer if one takes a broader view of technology itself. And that's what's unsettling to me. I don't blame Zuckerberg. I don't blame Christopher Wiley. But what I'm trying to draw attention to with this moment of a cusp of consolidation is the fragility and the opportunity of that design stage, of that formation stage, such that next generation Zuckerbergs, next generation formatters can, one would hope, format with a little more care and intention and perhaps luck. So, thank you.